In the first session, we focused on innovations in products, technology, and finance for better MHM in schools. Then we heard from funders and global leads, including opportunities that COVID-19 represents for innovation. But practitioners know that this is only one part of the equation. So in the second and final session of this conference, we will dedicate an hour to exploring innovations in programming and monitoring. These innovations are designed to address and capture a comprehensive range of aspects affecting girls' ability to manage their periods in a safe and dignified way. This includes access to menstrual products and facilities, but also to knowledge, skills, and social support. The innovations we're going to hear about rethink how we measure, how experiencing menstruation, putting girls' experience at the center of the monitoring, and how to address these aspects in an accessible, inclusive way. I will hand over first to Dr. Julie Hannigan, who is going to kick off this session. Julie is a research associate at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She undertakes mixed methods research, exploring the social determinants of women's health and the design and evaluation of complex social interventions. Dr. Hannigan leads multiple programs of menstrual health and hygiene research. Her recent project includes the development of measures to capture core concepts in menstrual health across contexts, as well as a multi-phase study to understand the sanitation and menstrual experience of adult women in workplaces in Uganda. She holds an MSc in evidence-based social intervention and a PhD in social interventions. Julie, over to you.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm glad that despite our physical distance, we can join together through this virtual conference and share innovations in the world of menstrual health and hygiene. The innovation I'm presenting today on behalf of my fantastic group of collaborators who are listed on the slide is the Menstrual Practice Needs Scale, or MPNS-36. This is a measure that we developed with the aim of placing girls' perspectives about their menstrual experience at the center of our research, monitoring, and evaluation efforts. So what did we set out to do? This project grew out of questions that I had and questions that I was hearing from others working in this space that I believe we won't be able to answer without new and validated measures. Questions like, how can I measure menstrual hygiene or menstrual health in my community? Well, you certainly could learn a lot from undertaking a qualitative study, undertaking interviews and focus groups, and learning about girls' experiences. But if you want to present numbers on the extent of unmet needs in your community, then you're going to need a way to measure them. Other questions like, what's the association? What's the relationship between menstrual experience and having a difficult time managing your period and school attendance or psychological well-being? Here again, if we want to present data on the strength of this relationship or compare it to other influences on girls' livelihoods, we can't do that without a way to measure important parts of menstrual experience. And ideally, we would be measuring those in a consistent way across different studies. How do I know if I've improved menstrual health or hygiene in my community? Here again, you might monitor your program delivery over time, you might talk to your recipients, but that's not going to generate information necessarily that you can present on how much things have improved or not. You could even do a big trial. You could have a ton of money and do a big RCT, and you might see differences in school absence or reproductive tract infections and conclude that your program is improving these outcomes, but you still might not be able to say that much about how you improve menstrual health or your recipient's menstrual experience if you've not actually been able to measure it. So with all of these sort of motivating questions in mind, our objective was to develop a tool that could measure a clearly defined component of girls' menstrual experience that could help us answer these questions. But what exactly do we measure? Girls' menstrual experience. So the first step in developing this or any measure is to have a really clearly defined construct or concept that you want to measure. We wanted to base our measure in the experiences of women and girls and our understanding of menstrual health and hygiene from the research that's been undertaken so far. So we started out with a big systematic review where we sought to identify as many qualitative studies of women and girls' experiences of menstruation as we could. We ended up with a total of 76 studies from 35 different countries, and we synthesized or brought together the findings from those studies and developed a model of menstrual experience. This provided us with a foundational theory to understand menstrual experience and to identify constructs that would be appropriate to measure. Within that, we decided that we wanted our measurement priority for this measure to be capturing experiences around managing menstrual bleeding. This is something that a lot of menstrual health interventions and research have focused on, improving this experience of effectively and comfortably managing menstruation. In our review, we found this was an important key component of girls' menstrual experiences, and that there were two different aspects of this. There were the practices that participants talked about, the behaviors, the things that they did to manage their menstrual bleeding, and there was the way that they felt about or perceived those practices and the environments that they did them in. So, for example, a menstrual practice would be the type of material that someone uses to absorb their blood, a pad, a cloth, a menstrual cup, whereas their perception might be whether or not they actually liked this material or product, if they were satisfied with it, if they thought that it was comfortable. Another practice might be how many times someone changes their menstrual materials, perhaps in a 24-hour period, but that's often separate from the perception of if they think they're able to change the materials as often as they want or need to. So in our review, we found that participants talked both, that they shared about the actual practices that they undertook, and they described their feelings about practices that they undertook and the spaces that they used. And these weren't necessarily the same or always the same for every practice that they were undertaking. So I know in a presentation like this, that difference can sound a little bit academic, but I think that this distinction and the way that we choose to measure it really matters. So I'd ask you to think about, just in a small list of examples that I have on the slide here, which of these do you think might be more relevant or important if your program or your study is interested in reproductive tract infections? If that's the case, you might be more interested in the type of menstrual material someone's using, how often they change it, and if they dry it in the sun to kill germs. But what if you're thinking about reducing girls' anxiety? Then you might be more interested if she feels comfortable with her menstrual materials, if she isn't worrying about when she's going to be able to change it, or if she's going to have a private space to dry it in. So what if you're thinking about school attendance? What if you're developing a survey or measures to monitor your intervention? What kinds of questions are you asking right now? And what kinds of concepts do you want to be asking about? So through the menstrual practice needs scale, we wanted to capture this concept of girls' perceptions of their practices and environments. The scale measures the extent to which a respondent's menstrual management practices and environment spaces were perceived to meet their needs during their last period. So after all of this foundational work, our review, we had this concept that we defined through the qualitative research. It was focused on girls' perspectives and experiences, and it was grounded in this theory that we've developed from our review based in women and girls' experiences of menstruation. We then needed to actually develop a way to measure this concept. So in addition to developing the concept, we had a few other key considerations that we'd drawn from past research and other preliminary work that we'd done to think about this. First, we wanted to make sure that we had comprehensive coverage across different menstrual practices. I know it's easy to ask the obvious, maybe what menstrual material someone is using, and it can be easy to ask questions that are singularly focused on what's offered in your particular interventional program. But we know that there are a lot of practices and activities that someone needs to do relevant to managing their menstruation, and we wanted our measure to capture experience across those different practices so that we weren't overly biased or overemphasizing one particular component. Second, we know that women and girls menstruate across their whole day. So they're often managing their period in all the different places that they would go during the day. And importantly for us, we've predetermined that home and school environments would be very different places to manage your menstruation, and the environments and how you feel about them might be quite different. So next, we developed a set of draft items for the scale. We again drew on our review where we had this fantastic resource of all this past qualitative studies across different countries so that we could make sure we had items that captured the breadth of practices and to inform the perceptions we were asking about and hope that these questions could be relevant across different contexts. We generated 54 items to test, and we also engaged some experts who generously reviewed a sample of items for us. I have some examples on the slide here. Each item is a statement in the draft items and in the final measure about the respondent's last period. So during my last period, my menstrual materials were comfortable. In response, the participant can indicate if this was true for them: never, sometimes, often, or always. Some of the item statements are positive, so having comfortable materials all of the time would be a more positive experience, and some of them are negative, like worrying more often that someone would see you while you were changing. Each of these responses corresponds to a score, so for items where always is a more positive experience, these are scored from 0 to 3, and for those where always, so worrying more often, is a more negative experience, these are scored from 3 to 0. We then needed to test our measure. We administered the tool in a group of over 500 schoolgirls across 12 schools in Suruchi, Uganda. And we used this data to test the performance of our draft items, to reduce down the scale to a final 36 items, and to test the structure, reliability, and validity of the scale. One of the first things we did was to look at the individual item performance and check that we had a good spread of responses. If we had items that were being answered always by everyone or never by everyone, then that item probably wasn't doing a very good job of understanding differences in experience. I think this slide, which is just a sort of random collection of the items, also shows what we can learn from the individual items in the scale before they're even combined to give us a picture of the experiences and needs in our population. We then looked at the structure of the scale. In setting out to measure menstrual practice needs, we knew that this was likely to be a multidimensional concept, a concept with different components to it. From the qualitative studies, we've seen that just because someone has their needs met in one particular practice, it doesn't mean others are being well met. So, for example, someone might have a positive perception, positive experience of their menstrual materials, but experience difficulties finding a safe or private place to change them. So in developing the scale, we used a series of statistical tests to look at the way our items sort of hung or grouped together as a way of identifying if there were consistent groupings of items that would reflect unique dimensions of the scale. Through this process, we identified 6 dimensions, so 6 subscales that together form the total 36 item scale. The first is items capturing having a material and home environment needs met. This is things like having places to store and change your materials at home, as well as having acceptable, comfortable materials. The second was perceptions and satisfaction around transporting materials, carrying them with you and with the school environment. We then had 2 dimensions that were made up of items around girls' worries and concerns around material reliability for the first one, like materials moving out of place or leaking. And the second, items around insecurities about changing or disposing of materials, worries about privacy and safety, that sort of thing. 2 final dimensions were relevant for those who used reused menstrual materials, so being able to wash and dry them and having those needs met, as well as worries about undertaking that task. So these findings suggest that having practice needs met isn't a singular concept, but the girls have experiences that vary across these different dimensions that we can capture using these subscales within the measure. We tested the reliability of the scale, that is how consistently respondents answered similar items, and we found this to be acceptable. In addition, we found that responses were sufficiently stable over time. So we administered the scale 2 weeks later to a subset of 58 of the original girls and found that those scores were acceptably stable. Finally, we tested the validity of the scale, and that is if our scale is measuring what we think it's measuring. We found that the scale and subscale scores were associated with other outcomes, other concepts that we would expect to be associated with this based on our theory and our understanding of menstrual health and menstrual experience from past research and from our review. And we found that the scale scores were associated with girls' psychological distress, was associated with their confidence to manage menstruation at home and at school, and separately for the subscales that were about home and school questions. Taken together, these findings support the validity of the scale, and we found that it was the subscales and the aggregate score were associated with self-reported absenteeism during the last year. For more details about our reliability and validity testing, I have a link later to the full peer review paper, where there's a lot more information about that I didn't have time to cover in this presentation, but you can check that out. It's available now if you're interested. So in summary, we outlined a clear concept for measurement grounded in our theory of menstrual experience and in girls' perspectives from the qualitative research. We generated draft items and we identified our final 36 items to make up the final scale. We found that the scale had acceptable reliability and validity, and that it contains multiple dimensions with subscales that capture these different aspects of menstrual practice needs. Our next steps, well, we're going to continue to test the measure among other groups and in other languages. We've just finished testing it with some adult women in Uganda, and we're looking to test it in other languages. And we also want to support others to start to use the measure. So the Menstrual Practice Needs Scale is available now. It's free to download and use. We've generated a little website where you can check out the full scale. You can see the translations that we have available so far. There's a PDF user guide that has some practical guidance for those wanting to use the scale and a frequently asked questions that I've been updating as I receive different questions about the measure. So thank you so much for your time, and do feel free to reach out if you have any questions about using the measure. You can check out the website and our peer review paper, or you can get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Fantastic. We have a couple of questions, and actually the first one relates to your final point, which is around to what extent are these scales applicable to a wide range of contexts. There's a specific question about using the measurements with women in garment factories in Bangladesh, but maybe you can answer this question a little bit more generally. What would I need to do to adapt the scales if I wanted to use it in a completely different context?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. So to use this in another context, so when we designed the measure, we had in mind that we wanted it to be usable across different settings. We know that people are doing their monitoring and evaluation, they're doing their studies in a lot of different contexts, and obviously those contexts are going to have unique challenges and needs, but we do need something that can be used across different settings. And so we certainly had that in mind when we drew the concept for measurement and the items from a review of studies across countries, rather than a sort of basing them just in Soroti, Uganda, where we did the testing. At the same time, so far we've just tested the scale in that population in Soroti, Uganda, and so it's validated for use in that population. If you want to use it in other contexts, I think that you can go ahead and do that. If you're interested in, this sort of, I guess, replicability of the structure of the scale, then we'll be looking to test it in more settings, and we'll be using, I guess, similar techniques to what we were using in developing the scale to see if these same dimensions fall out in other places, if the questions make sense. In your setting is something that you're obviously going to want to do as part of your pre-testing, but certainly the scale is something that people can take and use at the moment, but to use, I think, as we continue to test it in a critical way. So thinking about whether or not the questions need to be modified a bit when you're translating them, or making sure that they make sense for your context. And if you have the capacity to do so, or to partner with people to do so, to then test the validity in your setting as well.
Fantastic. That sounds like we have lots of more opportunities for collaboration here as well, just as we had in the first session. One technical question that I want to add to this to you, because I was faced with this along a lot of times when I worked in M&E. Why did you choose to focus on the girl's last menstruation rather than asking about what they usually feel or do about their normal menstruation? Because wouldn't that be like a more representative way of looking at the menstrual experience?
So I think that's a great question. And I think that, the time periods that we think about when we ask these kinds of questions are always an interesting part of designing them. When we ask about usual experience, we're asking someone to summarize across how they usually feel about their period. But we're not being very specific about the time period. Whereas when we ask about the last menstrual period, we have a defined set of time. So for one, if you're monitoring change over time and you've been implementing your project for 6 months, you may not want someone's average experience. How long ago is usually, what is that constructed as? Whereas the last menstrual period is a defined period that they can answer those questions about, and it's recent. So if you're looking at changes over time, then we want this to be relevant to your experience now, not your experience 6 months ago before the project started. We're also thinking about things like recall bias. So when I'm thinking back over a sort of indeterminate period of time, how do I usually feel? I can put in more of what I would like to feel potentially, what I think you want me to feel. And I think that there's more opportunities for bias to creep in there. We've seen this in research in other areas, when we ask about maybe sexual health practices. Do you use condoms? Yes, I always use them. Did you use one the last time that you had sex? Oh, well, no. So I think that there is actually variability in experience that comes out in measures when we think more specifically about particular periods of time, because I think sometimes when we think usually, we can actually sort of brush over perhaps those more defined incidents that might happen more infrequently.
Great, thank you very much. I can't see any more questions at this stage, but if there are any ones buried under the Slido pile of questions, we will make sure we ask them on Yammer or on other platforms and include them in the conference report. So we will make sure those will get answered. Thank you very much, Julie. Before we move on to our next and last presenter, 2 announcements for admin or housekeeping. The recordings, presentations, and the report will be available where you are joining the conference now on the conference website, mhvirtualconference.com. And some of the resources that we've been mentioning, including some COVID-19 related information on MH, are available at the conference as well. There's a resource page and also on Yammer. So please ask your question on Yammer and access the resources that are available there.